Hi, welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Markets, finance, scandal. The world is engulfed in financial scandal. Let's bring in Stacy Herbert right away and get all the latest updates on the political front. Yes, Stacy.
Max, the United States has gone bonkers.
Really? Tell me more.
I think either they're provoking for specific reasons or they're trying to establish a defense for the future trials. First headline reads, Paulson says Russia urged China to dump Fannie Freddie bonds.
All right, so Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary, former Goldman Sachs CEO, who's now, what is he doing now anyway? I think he's writing his memoirs or something.
This is from his memoirs, and we're not going to mention the name of the book because we don't want you to buy it, but he says in his...
I tell you what the name of the book should be. It should be Steal This Book, and I'll make triple on the insurance payout. That should be the name of Paulson's book. It's a dossier on how to steal money from the government. Remember Abbie Hoffman? He had that famous book in the 60s, Steal This Book. And Hank Paulson's doing his best Abbie Hoffman. Was it Abbie Hoffman? I think so. Yes, Abbie Hoffman impression with this latest memoirs. It's the anarchist's guide to how to blow up an economy. In this case, the American economy, and how to make millions doing it.
Well, Hank Paulson did, as everybody knows, he held up the U.S. Congress last year and demanded $700 billion for TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. He got that. But now, in his memoirs, he's blaming Russia. He says that he was in Beijing at the Olympics with President George Bush, and he learned of a disruptive scheme, he calls it in his book. He says the Russians made a top-level approach to the Chinese that, quote, together they might sell big chunks of their GSE holdings. GSE holdings are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to force the U.S. to use its emergency authorities to prop up those companies.
Okay, let's take this a bit at a time. First of all, he's at the Olympics, right? And he's having a confab with George Bush, and I also believe that Geithner was in on the meetings.
I'm not sure. I don't know about that.
Okay, now, in this case, for a sitting Treasury Secretary to be in on a meeting like that is explicitly illegal. So he's copping to an act of illegality right there, as has been covered in the press copiously. So he's basically admitting to having an illegal meeting with these guys. Then he's talking about participating in some kind of market manipulation scheme that he's now distancing himself from and denying. But the track record of the trading itself, if you look at the records, you know that he actually had a hand in these market manipulations and insider trading schemes. But of course, if you write a memoir and you go on Oprah and you claim that you're innocent, everything is forgiven in America. As long as you show up on Oprah and cry a little bit, it's okay.
So he goes on to say the report was deeply troubling, the report that the Russians were trying to force the Chinese to dump their Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bonds. He said heavy selling could create a sudden loss of confidence in the GSEs and shake the capital markets.
Well, let's be clear about something. Russia, China, and Iran should be dumping all government-backed bonds, because they're never going to get paid back any of this money. You think America's going to pay back China the $1.4 trillion that America owes China? That's never going to happen, China. You're smart to diversify into gold bullion because you're never going to get paid back any of this money. And Russia, of course, knows this as well. That's why Russia's buying gold bullion. And, of course, Iran is diversifying out of the dollar into trading their oil and gas in euros because they know that America's not good for it.
Well, you bring up the fact that China has bought gold. They doubled their gold holdings last year. Russia also bought a lot of gold. And the U.S. would consider this an act of financial war because it is against the dollar. The report in Bloomberg also notes that Russia sold its entire holdings of Fannie and Freddie bonds in 2008, which were $65.6 billion worth of bonds. But the point about this is that Hank Paulson's basically admitting the fact that the U.S. spends trillions every year on military expense. They spend more than the rest of the world. Right. And yet all it takes to take down the U.S. is that. Just dump their bonds.
This is a good point. In other words, all the military hardware that's being spent, the trillions for missiles and jets and Top Gun flying around. Oh, I got you, Maverick. I got you, Maverick. Yeah, I got the target in sight. all that stuff is for naught, because all it would take is for America's creditors, China, Russia, Iran, to hit the sell button on the U.S. bond market, and the dollar crashes. And there goes America, down the tube. Another lost empire. Another empire gone due to hubris and overreach.
That's what Hank Paulson seems to suggest. And by the way, Vladimir Putin's spokesperson denies that these allegations ever happened.
Right, because it's not about, actually, at this point, even attacking the U.S. It's just about preserving one's own national wealth. It makes no sense for these countries to hold on to this garbage, toxic bonds. They got out of it because it's good financial sense. But, of course, financial sense is something you don't hear about in the U.S. media or in the White House, certainly. All of Barack Obama's recent proposals make no financial sense whatsoever. But his recent proposal, for example, Stacy Herbert, he's going to force banks to reduce their exposure to hedge funds and private equity on the equity side. But the equity side is not the problem. The problem is the debt side. He doesn't mention anything about lending to the hedge funds and the private equity groups. That's where the abuse takes place. It shows complete ignorance about how the financial system works. You know, Obama knows about as much about world markets and finance, as, I do about something that I don't know anything about. I can't think of the apt comparison at the moment. Just send me an email.
Well, my response to the Paulson says Russia urged China to dump Fannie and Freddie bonds is that this is also a great way to play the fact that your own dollar is going to collapse, and let's try to already deflect the blame to somebody else. This takes me to the next headline. Clinton presses China over Iran nuke sanctions.
Okay, this is Hillary Clinton?
Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State of the United States, was in Paris last weekend. And she was with Nicolas Sarkozy. And remember, France controls much of the nuclear energy market around the world, building nuclear power plants and stuff. And the U.S. likes to be in on that game of controlling that market. So they're trying to force China to accept UN Security Council sanctions. And in Paris, Hillary Clinton threatened to isolate China and cut off their energy supplies if they don't agree.
What's she going to do, sit on them? How is she going to cut off? How can she threaten China? It makes no sense. First of all, China, even in the real war that's going on, the cyber war, the war that's taking place between, let's say, China and Google, China has the firepower and is winning that war because most of the internet's going to be in Chinese in another 5 years. It'll be totally dominated in Chinese. They're not going to win any of these wars. The U.S.
So Hillary Clinton is here in Paris, and she's stressing that a nuclear-armed Iran. They keep arguing that a nuclear-armed Iran cannot happen, even though all of the international atomic energy agencies are there and say they're not building a nuclear weapon. Iran says they're not building a nuclear weapon. But America is shrieking around the world saying, we've got to stop them. So you have another headline, U.S. raises stakes on Iran by sending in ships and missiles. So they've just suddenly sent all these ships and Patriot missiles into Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE. And Petraeus uses the phrase that he says the UAE could wipe out the Iranian Air Force with the weapons we've sold them.
Right. So he wasn't talking about Israel? Because they're the only nuclear threat in the region.
Well, exactly. But, I'm asking myself, why has America gone crazy this week? Why are they threatening Russia? Why are they threatening China? And why are they threatening Iran? And, of course, it's budget week. The headline reads, Obama unveils $3.83 trillion budget with massive deficits. This year, 2010, the deficit is projected to be $1.6 trillion. So here's a warmongering nation going around the world threatening everybody, and they're in debt. Like they can't even afford anything.
What was the number? 3 point what?
$3.83 trillion.
Right, and I think if you add up all the debts in America, including all the unfunded liabilities like Medicare and Social Security, every single American citizen has a debt overhang above their head of several $100,000. And Obama is threatening the world?
Yes, Nobel Peace Prize winner Barack Obama is threatening China, Russia, Iran, several other countries. But the headline also includes this, that war spending surges in President Obama's budget. So he's tripled the military budget, the war budget, compared to what he told people who voted for him. On the campaign trail, he promised to cut it, but now he's actually tripled it from what he promised.
Well, he's lied at just about everything that he ran on, and unfortunately, he's turning into an enormous, really, liability for the American society and the American economy going forward. And we can only hope that he's out of there in a few years.
Well, the other thing is that, so America has these massive deficits. They're threatening China, who's been, up until now, the biggest buyer of the U.S. debt. Whether or not China will want to continue that, maybe it looks like they're not continuing it. Maybe they aren't buying it. And in fact, records do show that they're slowing down their purchases of U.S. treasuries. So where do they go? The only other place that has any money that significant is Abu Dhabi. And Abu Dhabi is in this article about surrounding Iran with missiles because they're worrying about Abu Dhabi being now a victim. They might be a victim of Iranian aggression as a U.S. Satellite in the region. So I'm thinking that this could possibly be a way to sell more weapons to Abu Dhabi.
Well, just an interjection there. One of the benefits in terms of Abu Dhabi of the collapse of Dubai was that Dubai was friendly with Iran. Now that Dubai has collapsed, and Abu Dhabi has effectively taken over Dubai, then all the saber rattling against Iran has commenced. So this is all, this is all basically part and parcel of the global real estate collapse. Yes. And when you shut off the credit spigot, all of these countries and all of these corporations and all these potentates, kings, rulers, and monopolists are all scrambling for the remaining ducats on the table. Because there are no more free credit. There's no more free lunch. Because we're in a massive global deflationary spiral. Which is sucking the air out of all of the power base of these folks who have relied on cheap money for decades to finance their warmongering, fear-mongering, and monopolistic activities.
Well, before we go, I might want to add one more thing. Is because the Abu Dhabi has $1 trillion, and they have not spent it much recently on bailing out the U.S. banks and the U.S. system. But because of the emerging conflict in the region based on the U.S. saber-rattling against Iran, the UAE recently bought 80 U.S.-made military fighter jets. It is also buying fighters from France, where Hillary Clinton was, with President Sarkozy, saber-rattling against the region.
What a waste of money. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much.
Thank you, Max.
When we come back, much more, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. John Perkins, he's the author of the international bestseller, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. His latest book is Hoodwinked. John Perkins, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Max. Great to be with you.
Okay, John Perkins, in your first book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you lay out the case of how these economic hitmen work. Basically, they support local dictators in various countries. They load them up with a lot of debt. And if they don't pay the debt, they send in, as you call them, the jackals, and they whack these guys. So debt is used as a weapon to control these countries as part of this whole methodology of the economic hitman. Is that basically the framework?
That's correct. It's the new form of empire building through debt rather than through the military. The military only comes in as a last resort.
Okay, so that's a key point, is that when people think empire, they're thinking 17th, 18th century type empire building, and they don't. This is the new empire building using financial weapons, as it were, in debt to build these empires. Now, the obvious question is, has America is in the throes of being subjected to economic hitman?
Absolutely. You know, what goes around comes around. And I think we in the United States accepted this for a long time. We accepted that these economic hitmen would go to other countries, be able to exploit their resources, bring us really cheap tennis shoes and T-shirts that are made in slave sweatshops, bring us cheap petroleum that comes from destroying rainforests. We accepted this. We put up. We turned a blind eye to it. And now it's come home to roost. And so the same techniques that have been used in the third world and building this empire overseas are now being used against the American people.
So in the United States, when Barack Obama talks about these huge debts and he has to somehow get down the deficits, and he talks about it in terms that people are familiar with the business cycle and neoclassical economics, and we need to increase savings and maybe try to increase production. But what you're suggesting, and what I think a lot of people are seeing as the more obvious situation here, is that the same methodology used around the world by the U.S. to subjugate foreign countries is basically being used by these Wall Street banks to subjugate Americans. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. The same techniques, Max, are being used here. You know, what comes around goes around, and the economic hitmen have really come home to roost. As an example, just one of many examples, in third world countries, we encouraged them to take on huge amounts of debt that they really couldn't afford, and we said the collateral was the oil still in the ground, and that eventually they'd be able to pay back their debts and become very wealthy in the process through their oil. Well, in the United States, the bankers went in and told people that they could afford a $500,000. In fact, they could only afford a $300,000 house. But the bankers said, you know, tighten your belts and pay this mortgage on the $500,000 house. In a few years, 5 years from now, it'll be worth $1 million. So you're going to get wealthy off this. And, of course, that didn't happen. The bottom fell out of the market. That house now is only worth maybe $200,000. The poor guy who took out the loan is still paying on the $500,000, or he's being foreclosed on. The banks are picking these houses up for 10 cents on the dollar. They'll refinance them, remarket them, sell them again. So they actually have sold the house twice. They're making a lot of money off this, and people are being left out on the street without homes. And in the process, incidentally, when you have that kind of debt and you can't pay it, you don't go out in the streets and protest. You don't cause any problems. You're trying desperately to hold on to your house, your job, to get a new job, to please the banks. You don't rebel against this. Debt is a real enslaving tool, and that's just one of many examples of the kind of techniques that we honed overseas and now are using in this country.
Right, and another technique America has honed overseas, of course, is the use of propaganda, and it seems as though propaganda is now in the United States. When you watch CNBC or James Cramer or these rah-rah cheerleading shows on CNBC, it's a way to propagandize this notion of buying homes that you can't afford, to buy stocks on margin that you can't afford. So this is CNBC has become the biggest propaganda outlet in the world.
The production of myths that lend to the whole system. And, you know, Max, this system is really based on the fact that in 1980, when Ronald Reagan became president, the U.S. government officially replaced Keynesian economics, John Maynard Keynes' form of economics, which was fairly compassionate, with Milton Friedman's form of economics that came out of the Chicago School, which I call predatory economics. And it's built real assumptions. One, that the only business of business is to maximize profits in the short run, regardless of social and environmental costs. 2, businesses shouldn't be regulated because that gets in the way of making profits. And 3, everything should essentially be run by private business. Schools, jails, even the military now in the United States has become very much privatized. And these 3 premises that have really taken over in the last 40 years have brought us to this terrible situation that we in the United States and, in fact, the whole world is in today. It's a predatory form of capitalism. It's a mutant form of capitalism, and it's very, very dangerous. we must turn it around.
Okay, you mentioned Milton Friedman, of course, the Chicago School of Economics, and of course that brings up Barack Obama, who went through that system. He's a big believer in this Milton Friedman-esque version of mutant capitalism. I want to play a quick clip from John Pilger. He's talking about Obama, who worked for an organization called Business International. So we'll play this clip briefly, and then I want to ask you a question about it. So play that clip.
In his book, Dreams from My Father, Obama refers to the job he took after he graduated from Columbia in 1983. He describes his employer as, and I quote, a consulting house to multinational corporations, unquote. For some reason, he doesn't say who his employer was or what he did there. The employer was Business International Corporation, which has a long history of providing cover for the CIA with covert action and infiltrating unions and the left.
The question is Obama an economic hitman?
Well, you know, Max, I don't like to speculate. I write about things I know firsthand, and I don't know anything about that firsthand. But I will say that I think in this country today, nobody gets high up in politics, president or otherwise, without being very, very closely associated with the corporatocracy.
Okay, now the recent collapse of the U.S. economy, John Perkins, was that basically by design? In other words, a controlled demolition?
It was a controlled demolition, and it got out of hand a bit. And so now it's getting back in hand, and we're seeing Wall Street make exceptional profits, record-breaking profits, and pay themselves record-breaking bonuses once again. So it's back on course, and it was planned to a certain degree, absolutely.
Now, in Hoodwinked, you see light at the end of the tunnel. For who and how would that take place?
Well, my premise in Hoodwinked is, that the geopolitics around the world today is controlled by big corporations, that in the recent past, we've seen the world as this globe with roughly 200 countries, of which a few had a lot of power, the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom. But today, you might better see the same globe, 200 countries, with huge clouds drifting around the planet that know no national borders, don't follow any specific sets of laws. These are the big corporations. They strike deals, make partnerships with the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Tibetans and the Russians and the Israelis and the Arab nations with whoever has markets that they covet or resources they covet. And they are calling the shots. But we have to remember that ultimately they are dependent upon the consumer or tax dollars. They're dependent on getting money elsewhere. It's not like the old empires that were totally dependent on military. These have not built this empire with the military, although the military goes in at times. So we have a lot of control over those corporations based on the way we shop, based on the people we idolize, who we put on the covers of our magazines, based on the laws that we pass that protect corporations. We really need to come up with a system that says, it's okay for corporations to maximize profits, but only if they're also committed to creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world, and to only buy from those corporations, and to insist that our government only buy from those corporations. It's fairly easy for us as consumers only to buy from those kinds of corporations and send them emails and tell Nike we're not buying from them because they have slave shops, sweatshops in Indonesia. And if enough of us do that, Nike will have to change.
Let's just talk briefly about the CIA and their front groups. You talk about this in Hoodwinked, and the role of U.S. corporations and the CIA in the Honduras coup. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when Zelaya was democratically elected president of Honduras, soon after he came in, he proclaimed that the wage rate would be increased. Well, Dole and Chiquita and Kraft and Cargill and other companies like that, and Russell Athletics, sweatshop companies, did not want to hear that. Honduras has one of the lowest wage rates in the hemisphere. They didn't want those wages to go up, not just because it would affect them in Honduras, but it would mean that wage rates all over Latin America would have to go up because nobody wants to be below Honduras and Haiti. And so they went to Zelaya. They sent in the economic hitmen, tried to convince Zelaya to change. He also was going to change the Constitution to make it more favorable to the people rather than the big landowners, the oligarchies. The economic hitmen were not able to turn him around. And so a general who was trained at the U.S. School of the Americas was sent in and overthrew Zelaya. It put the Obama administration in a very interesting position because here was a democratically elected president overthrown with the help of the CIA because U.S. corporations wanted it. And Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, had been one of the lead attorneys for Chiquita, which used to be United Fruit, which was one of the conspirators behind this plan to overthrow Zelaya. Halder had been Chiquita's attorney in Colombia when Colombia brought a suit against Chiquita for hiring assassins to take out union leaders in Colombia. Halder lost the case.
But
Chiquita...
we've come full circle, because the whole economic hitman premise started in that region back, I think, in the after World War II, and as the U.S. started to expand after World War II, the Latin America and Central America and the so-called banana republics, this was the beginning of the whole economic hitman cycle. So now it's returning on itself again, and it's like a new cycle in this whole economic hitman in the region. And at the same time, you find the same abuses right inside America.
Same people in Latin America, incidentally. United Fruit, which is now Chiquita, was behind the coup that overthrew Arbenz of Guatemala in the early 50s, what you were referring to. Yeah, one of the first of these. And almost the same scenario in Honduras just this past year. Okay, John Perkins, we're going to have to end it there. John Perkins, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report. My pleasure, Max. And that's going to do it for this episode. I want to thank my guests, Stacy Herbert and John Perkins. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.